Good morning. So I am going to cover a very, very interesting topic, the topic of failure. I think it's a really dominant narrative in everybody's lives, and is something that we never really get to kind of talk about outside of that safe space with our therapists on a Friday morning. And it has been an incredibly interesting topic and an interesting subject matter for me personally, and let me share with you why. So I come from a part of the world that is awash with ravaging beauty. It is also economically screwed. It is financially defunct. It owes various other governments and banks several $billion worth of capital. And it is a fledgling or fully fledged democracy, but not much has changed in the last 75 years. So if I was to stand up here and the sort of pigmentation of my skin was a slightly different color, you would probably think I came from this part of the world, which was Africa, because that's a dominant story that we hear about the African markets, and certainly about the continent at large. But despite my many years here, I am not. I'm Irish. And the annoying twang in my accent is purely by chance. In fact, we tend to say that the American accent is based on a well-traveled Irish accent. Most Americans tended to go, or most Irish people tended to go west, and they landed in New York and Boston, and unfortunately I took the wrong turn at the airport, and I came south and ended up in originally Johannesburg, and more frequently I spent most of my time in places like Lagos, Nairobi, Lusaka, Accra, basically spreading myself across the continent. But just to sort of zone in on the sort of the sharing part and on the failure part, I think some cultures are just destined or set up historically to fail. And certainly where I come from, that's a very, very strong narrative. This wonderful portrait of Charles Dickens, who's a very interesting gentleman. Apart from being a well-known author, he was also one of the major promoters of colonialism. And in the 1860s, he stood up in the British Parliament and he gave a speech about how the Irish Parliament was quite similar in its behavior and mannerisms to that of a Zulu war tribe. And the British Empire spent quite a lot of money and quite a lot of time establishing something called the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain, which was designed to prove one thing at its time. It was designed to prove that Irish people were in fact the lost tribe of Africa, that we had made our way up the west coast of Africa over into Spain, somehow didn't like the weather, and decided to go to Dublin and other cities around Ireland because that's where we wanted to be. And it's a very interesting case, because being Irish in Africa is quite an interesting thing. You are essentially not African because you are white, but you are also not necessarily European because you were never considered such. There's a wonderful novelist called Roddy Doyle. He wrote a book called The Commitments. It was translated into a very famous movie, and the one line everybody remembers from The Commitments is this saxophonist saying this one very famous line he talks about. He says, the Irish are the blacks of Europe, and if you're from Dublin, then you're the blacks of Ireland. And if you're from the north side of Dublin, then you are the blacks of Dublin. And he says, say it once, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. So being Irish across Africa is very, very interesting, because you obviously have a sort of an outsider's perspective. You have this sense of being able to look in from the outside because you were not born here, but from a cultural perspective, we draw a lot of our cultural similarities or our cultural roots from this part of the world. And what's been quite interesting about that process is our ability to blend in, and our ability to kind of engage with people in the design space, with people in the business space across the continent. So I think part of my interest has been in the last decade has been around exploring that kind of context of failure, in the sense of why are certain things not the way they are? So why are certain economies, why are certain societies not doing as well as we think they might do? And in a certain extent, why are they failing? Or why are they, more importantly, perceived to be failing? So I don't come from a failed country. It's quite a successful little island. It neatly fits into Lagos in terms of population size, and it's about the size of the Kruger Park. So it's not a particularly big place, but it's quite a dominant cultural influence in certain parts of the world. And we find that that sort of culture from an African perspective is very, very similar. It's very, very dominant, but it's also very much an under-discovered and under-discussed narrative. So these two things kind of came quite close together for me, and the sort of fulcrum in the balance of my Irishness and my Africanness came about in the 2010 World Cup, where the Irish football team once again did not qualify for the World Cup. In fact, we kind of almost did qualify. And then there was the very famous handball incident by Thierry Henry that kept us out of the World Cup, and Irish diplomats were pulled out of France, and it was a big international incident, and we went to FIFA, and we pleaded with FIFA to allow us to be the additional team into the World Cup, and obviously they decided they declined. But I think one battles to talk about the subject of failure if one cannot at least share one's own failures, of which there have been many, I might add, over the decades. But I think this one is one of our sort of best ideas, only equaled by its monumental failure, which was around the World Cup. And the World Cup was a very interesting time for me because I'd expected to be, chaperoning my national team through the country for some time. That didn't happen. So what did happen was I saw a very interesting campaign by a mobile operator who shall not be named, but their majority color is yellow, who launched an ad campaign talking about Africa United. And I looked at this campaign for an extended period of time, and I was quite shocked. They had decided to rewrite the geopolitical structure of Africa because they had excluded an African country from their campaign that they did not have a mobile network in. So there were 6 African countries in the 2010 World Cup. Only 5 made it onto the list. The one that didn't make it onto the list was Algeria, because they were not necessarily represented by this particular network. So being prone to bouts of idealism, which is an interesting kind of failure within itself sometimes, we decided to sort of address this issue. So we hooked up with an interesting group of people who represented the fans from all 6 African countries. They had done a deal with FIFA. And that deal was to bring, to acquire seats at each of the African games. An entire block, it was about 300 seats. Of course, they had no money for this, and they neglected to tell FIFA that, but they had got the tickets. And we launched this idea on Africa Day, which is on the 25th of May, which is just before the World Cup, called Hola Six Pack, which was this very magnanimous idea designed to bring all 6 African countries together and really be a kind of a genuine platform for people to celebrate it. And I did it with a couple of friends of mine, and we launched on the 25th to great fanfare. We got an awful lot of exposure on the 7 o'clock news. We made the front page of the newspaper the next day. And then nothing happened. Our dear friends from the African Football Supporters Club disappeared with approximately, I think about 9,000 tickets, and they flooded them onto the black market. And us and the other fans got left with this kind of this burden of trying to represent this kind of concept through the World Cup. So we had printed, I think, about 10,000 T-shirts, of which about 2,000 we sold, and then the balance we had to give away at the games because we thought that was the right thing to do. But this was quite a dramatic kind of continental, if not monumental, failure. And the reason I kind of start off with that is because it kind of opened my eyes to the naivety of what I tend to see working across the continent on a day-to-day basis, is people with very good ideas assuming that the markets that we operate in are not evolved, are not developed, and not structured, and that somehow if we come with this great thing, that's just going to get sucked up into the ether automatically and people will run with it. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So what I've kind of done is just identified a couple of what I call the classics. And the one classic for me is this myth that exists across the continent around the middle class. And we are estimated to have approximately 300 million middle class people across the African continent, which is quite a thing considering there are only about 350 middle class North Americans. So how did we all of a sudden come from being this really poor continent to being almost on the same scale economically as a big superpower like North America. The reality is we didn't. But this is the kind of dominant narrative that's been put out into the marketplace for the last number of years. And one of the reasons it succeeds is it succeeds for reasons like this is because magazines and publications that have a genuine balanced story to tell about what goes on across the continent aren't particularly widely read. And those that are kind of well consumed in numbers can print bluntly almost whatever they like and people will believe it. So this figure of 300 million was generated out of the World Bank. It was done with one of the major consulting firms, and it started to do the rounds. And in journalism, what sometimes happens is I see a story in the Washington Post or in the New York Times, and someone reruns that same story without sort of actively kind of interrogating the number or interrogating the context and the concept. And a lot of the people that did that were business people. And we feel very concerned and sometimes quite empathetic for a lot of the people that we meet traveling across the continent, because they typically are given these large territories, sometimes all 54 countries. That's your market. And you're expected to sort of engage with that market on a regular basis. And the reality is, for a lot of business people traveling across Africa, they see three things. They see the inside of an airplane, the inside of a hotel room, and the inside of a boardroom. And that's it. Now, just to go back to the number, this number came up based on an economic model that pegged the middle class in Africa at an earning capacity of $2 a day. So if you're earning more than $2 a day across Africa, you're in the middle class, which is quite funny, because if you're earning less than $20 a day in Europe, you're below the poverty line. Consider the irony. You've got these well-meaning young people running around sort of Western cities collecting for the poor children of Africa, earning less than $1 a day, and you have global conglomerates popping bottles of champagne, celebrating the size of the African middle class at 300 million. In reality, that's not the case. In reality, if you apply a much more sober metric to it, you'll find that the kind of middle class in the continent sits in about the 100 million mark. And that's applying about a $20 a day metric, which brings the number down quite dramatically. The good news is it's growing quite quickly, and it will get to that 300 million probably in about 15 years' time, but we're nowhere near there right now. So typically what has happened is an awful lot of major multinationals have set up shop across the continent of Africa to try and trade and engage with the mass market, with the bottom of the pyramid, but more importantly with the middle class market. And several years later, they've discovered they're just simply not there. And it has caused untold stress for businesses that believed this was sort of the commercial recolonization of the continent, and where in reality that wasn't the case. However, what we do typically say is that the real big five in Africa are these cities. It's Lagos, Nairobi, Lusaka, Accra, and Luanda, and they are where the sort of future growth is typically coming from. And another reason I think that this sort of myth endures is because we don't want to spend enough time on the ground or spend enough time immersing ourselves in somebody else's culture, somebody else's way of doing business. That's quite important. So I'll talk a little bit about design as we get through this process, but what I would prefer to talk about is the factors that influence that, because there are much better designers and much better people that can talk around that topic, specifically in terms of the kinds of design that's coming out of Africa right now. So I think one of the key things for us is if you are a business person, if you have a product, if you have a service, and you are wanting to take it kind of into these markets, there are just a couple of simple things that are worth looking at. The first is kind of understanding the impact of aspiration. So I think intellectually everybody gets this fact that the continent is an aspirational market, but I don't think people understand the real meaning behind it and how aspirational it is. And I'll use a story. Two incredibly good brands. One is a local brand, a South African organization called Woolworths. The second is a global company called Levi's. Now, one does really well, and one does really badly. Itself to be the biggest economy in the continent in the last couple of months, Woolworths pulled out of Lagos in terms of all their operations, citing operational constraints. But in reality, if you speak to young Nigerians, they consider this to be a South African middle-class brand. And even if you're working on the side of the road and you're a hawker or a trader, you don't aspire to be what people in the South are. You aspire to be what people in the North are, and which is wealthy. What's also really interesting is you find that the same consumer who wouldn't go into a Woolworths store and buy maybe a new pair of jeans or a clothing item will buy a second-hand pair of Levi jeans on the side of the road because the badge has an aspirational value attached to it. you'll see in market, in places like Nigeria, and specifically in West Africa, there's an amazing website called Bellanaija.com. So Bellanaija is a social website. It is not particularly massive. It has a couple of 100,000 sort of followers, but its impact and influence on specifically West African and Nigerian society is quite impressive. If you got married and your wedding photographs did not appear on the pages of Bellanaija.com, you did not get married. If your product launch did not make it to the social pages of Bellanaija.com, your product launch did not happen. Such is the impact of a group of young people who came together, put this really impressive package together, who said, this is what it means to be successful in West Africa, and we'll determine that, and everybody else follows. So that the idea of aspiration and the idea of products that are tapping into that cannot be understated. There are many brands that are doing a lot of price and product style promotion, really good product in the market at a really good price, not doing particularly well. The same consumer will rather save up for quite a battered third or fourth hand BMW than buy a brand new market that was designed specifically for their, or a brand new car that was designed specifically for their needs, because it does not have the necessary aspirational value to go with it. The other one, which is really interesting, is the idea of awareness. And the idea that we all know that we have, to a certain extent, leapfrogged fixed line phones into the mobile era. We also, I think to a certain extent, accept that computing, we've also leapfrogged the kind of desktop and even to a certain extent the laptop into the mobile era. But what's not kind of apparent enough is the fact that in many of these markets, people have leapfrogged retail and gone straight into the mobile space. So new brands are coming on stream, not even putting up a store because they can't afford to. If you look at some of the prices to open up a store in a mall in some of the swanky places across the continent, you're looking at $150 a square meter. Do the math, it's rather expensive. Mobile connectivity is really driving not just certain types of behavior, it's driving retail. And it's driving retail in a really, really interesting way. Here's an example of a very good radio station in East Africa, in Nairobi, called Kiss FM. So there's a friend of mine, he's a DJ on Kiss FM, and every so often he does this really funny competition where he takes the latest cell phone, so top of the range cell phone, he hides it in a tree somewhere across Nairobi. And then he gives out clues on radio as to where this phone is hidden. Now, I spend a lot of time in Nairobi, and if you've been there, you'll know that traffic is not pleasant. It got to the point where the police had to shut them down because they were creating such congestion of all these hundreds of young people driving around in matatas, which are taxis, looking for this phone in a tree because they had nothing else to do in that particular day, and it was the latest thing. And if they got that phone, they would be able to share that experience with thousands of their closest friends. We call this a triple A. The other A is age. When you talk to people on the continent, you are talking to children, demographically speaking. If you are over 35, you are an elderly niche. The vast majority of the population is below the age of 21, and I think currently it changes obviously all the time, but the median age is about 17. So when you're talking to new consumers, that's who you're talking to. And brands are starting to become aware of this. And we talk to designers as well, and I was talking to some of them a short while ago and saying, the products you're putting into the market are fantastic, but what about that target audience? What about children? What about toys? What about playthings? What about locally generated African toys and African devices that can service that particular market? Because it is absolutely massive. And if you're in that space as a parent, you know, you want to do the best for your children, so you'll share with them whatever you can. And if you have children, you'll be very familiar with this little character called Dora the Explorer. Dora is to children's TV what Lionel Messi is to football. She's a rock star. But what Dora did was Dora came to Lagos a short while ago in a campaign to help young children open savings accounts. And they thought a couple of hundred kids would show up outside the main branch and they would have a little sort of activation and it would all go well. Several thousand children showed up. Dora was running down the high street in Lagos trying to escape the clutches of 5,000 little kids who wanted her autograph and who had grown up with her for the last couple of years, and she had come to their town for the first time. So I think what we tend to sort of need to do is understand a lot closer and a lot more seriously what actually goes on, and not assume it's like everywhere else. It isn't. It's unique, it's special, it's fantastic, it's wonderful, and it is kind of Africa. The other thing is quite interesting to sort of observe is that we have this habit in the West of categorizing brands in a sort of listed fashion. What I mean by that is, if you're a listed entity and you trade in the New York Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange, you can kind of get access into these competitions, or you get onto these surveys. A lot of the big media houses do them. They have the top 100 brands across the world. And now, more recently, you're seeing the top 100 brands across the continent of Africa. But they're quite limiting, and they give a very, very jaundiced picture. They share with us some statistics. They share with us, this is a company, it's listed somewhere, it's a very legitimate, very sort of formalized organization. But you'll never see this. You'll never see Chelsea Football Club appearing on the list of the top 100 brands across Africa. Yet people will jump off the top floor of a building if Chelsea lose badly on the weekend. I mean, I don't know what happens if you're a Liverpool supporter, because then there's a good chance there are none left. But the reality is that brands across the continent, the ones that make people tick, are the ones that tap into their emotional strings in a very, very deep way. And football does that like you cannot believe. The depression that descends over Accra on a Monday after a team like Arsenal or Chelsea has lost on the weekend is palatable. You can feel it in the air. And this is because they have relationships with these organizations and with these brands and with these teams that they don't even have with their own mother. It's quite deep and it's quite brutal. The other category that I find is really interesting is Christianity. So Christianity as an industry is absolutely massive. I had the great pleasure to do a little bit of work for this gentleman. His name is Pastor Chris Oyekilomi. He is what I would consider the poster boy for big kind of Christian pastor brands across the continent. He has a church that I've attended in Lagos that seats 25,000 people. Although that is not the biggest, that sort of honor lies with Pastor David of Winners Chapel. Pastor David has a church that seats 50,000 people. There is a runway at the back of the church that houses one of his 3 Learjets, which he uses to commute in to do a service and then to fly on to the next state or country to do the next one. And he is an absolute megastar. He's the biggest, but this guy for me is the best. He's the best because take out the religious aspect of it, treat it as a business. 4 TV channels, radio stations, hotel groups, fast food restaurants, social media sites, a publication that does more internationally called the Rhapsody Publication Series, that does more circulation internationally on a monthly basis than The Economist. It is a mega industry. These are the big brands. These are the big personalities and the big characters that are to a certain extent dominating the discourse and the conversation. But when we look in from the outside, we fail to see they exist because we're looking at Western media talking about a market that is not Western. We're talking to, we're looking at the news on BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera, and we're talking to journalists who are not necessarily in the market. Another example is this lovely lady. This is Mercy Johnson. Mercy Johnson is what Julia Roberts is to Hollywood, Mercy Johnson is to Nollywood. Nollywood, I love Nollywood. I think it is amazing. And not because of the quality of the productions, because I'm not going to comment on that because that's not my space. I'm not a cinematographer. I don't know if it's good or bad, and I don't know if it works in the market or it doesn't work. But what I do know is the industry produces about 1,000 movies a year. That's twice the volume that gets produced in Hollywood, and slightly less than the volume that gets produced in Nollywood in Bombay. They have a market, a captive market of 300 million people. That they engage with them. What really excites me about their model is it's a locally generated model. So they accept the standards and they accept the norms of the industry, and they accept that bootlegging exists. So what do? Is they beat the bootleggers to the bootlegging. They will take a product and they will circulate it onto cinema screen, which is maybe not in, let's say Nigeria is about 50 or 60 cinema screens. They will take and they will do about on average 150 to 200,000 CDs or DVDs on release day. And then they'll send it to the beautiful portal called iRocka.com, which is a digital portal that shares globally kind of Nollywood movies. And it's a low-cost model that gets into the market very fast. It distributes very, very quickly. You can look at about 90 days from concept to hitting the market. And it's something we need to learn from. Because this idea of shooting a movie, putting it into the cinema, waiting for 90 days before we release it on DVD, and then waiting for another 90 days before we release it on digital television, means that we're going through almost a sort of a full 12 months before you are legitimately supposed to go access the movie. But we all know most of the movies we get on pirate copy from our friends, usually a week after release, which is not right. But given the choice, would we buy that product if it was available to us legitimately? Possibly we would, but we're not given the option to do so. These guys understand that really well. So again, I think what we typically find is the reason sort of traditional cinema and traditional sort of that sort of side of art doesn't necessarily do so well in terms of its release numbers is it behaves like it behaves in somewhere like New York or somewhere like San Francisco. It doesn't behave like the market behaves, and the market behaves quite differently. What is absolutely unparalleled, and you'll see it within 100% design today, is the sort of the rise and the dominance of African design. And what we're starting to find is that young African designers are coming up with this absolutely amazing design talent and design style. They're sharing it with different people from across the world, and they're doing it in a very unique fashion. No one's told them what to do. They're not trying to imitate anybody else. They're not out there trying to sort of look at product that's sort of maybe Northern European or Bauhaus or Art Deco style stuff from the early 1900s in North America. They're genuinely going about it themselves, sometimes in an untrained fashion, sometimes in a trained fashion. And they're creating product that is thoroughly unique. So this whole design movement across the continent is frustrating some people and delighting others. The reason it's frustrating some people is because they can't define it. They want to say it should look like that. It should be a specific style. Like if you were to see an Art Deco piece, even if you never studied design, you kind of understand that's Art Deco because everybody conformed to a certain design style or design type. If you look at something like Bauhaus, it's kind of easy to see where that comes from, and it's easy to recognize that as a piece of design. What's beautiful around the design movement at the moment across the continent is no one's telling them what's right or what's wrong. They've just gone and they've reinterpreted their history, and they've reinterpreted their culture in some very, very new and interesting ways. And the talent out there is absolutely amazing. And I suppose what I sort of do a little bit is I spend time with these guys. I'm not a designer. I won an art competition in the 4th grade, and it's kind of been downhill since then. But what I have done is spend a large amount of my time on the business side of design, working with designers and design groups and saying, I want you to be successful. And I want you to be an absolute sort of heavy hitter internationally. What I don't want you to do is be like Van Gogh. I don't want you to do masterpieces that only get recognized several years or several decades after your death. I want you to be financially successful. So there's one narrative that sort of rolls around a little bit is this issue of why designers are not as successful as we want them to be. And sometimes we force that on them. There was a very interesting a lamp that was designed by a young East African designer recently, and it was appalling to look at from a design point of view. It's called, typically now it's called non-design. And there were 1,000 units developed. They were shipped off to North America, and they were auctioned off at a charity event for about $1,000 a piece. Because the perception of what design was shame, let's support the poor guys in the design space. And I was horrified by that whole process, because there is tons of talent in the marketplace from everywhere like Senegal to Burkina Faso to Mali. We've seen some amazing people here in South Africa, in Swaziland, and all over the place that do this kind of stuff. So one of the sort of dominant sort of narratives that we kind of want, and we want that to fail. We want the sort of Afro-kitsch movement to fail quite drastically, and it is. It's really interesting, even traveling through African airports, whether you're in Lagos or Nairobi or Kigali or Lusaka, you see the same dodgy wooden carvings that were probably all mass manufactured in Taiwan. They look the same because people have assumed that's all we can produce. The reality is there's this bubbling movement. There's this bubbling idea that design is very, very different, and that continental designers are doing some unique stuff. And it's starting to do really, really well. There's an organization, it's a continental organization called Design Network Africa, that really brings together the best of continental design, and it showcases it all over the world. They go to Art Miami, to Art Dubai, to Art Basel, all the top art shows, and the stuff disappears off the shelf. And the reason it disappears off the shelf is simply because it is so interesting and so unique. Recently in Cape Town, there was an event called Guild, which was the bringing together of the best of continental design matched with international design. It was like having Chelsea, Manchester United, Liverpool, all in the same place at the same time from a design point of view. It was by far one of the most successful design shows internationally. And from a design point of view, we need much more of that. We need to celebrate, allow what has gone before to fail, embrace what is new, support it, give it its due, give it its credence, and let it flow into the market. And I think the more we do that, we will we'll be able to sort of, what we would like to say, fail faster, which will hopefully equip us to succeed better in the future. Because the talent in the branding space and the talent in the design space across this continent right now is unparalleled. It's unique and it's different, and it's bubbling beautifully to the surface. Thank you. So I will take questions, but not on my Irish heritage. Everything else is open season. Ross. That's a dangerous question. I got quite a few of them. I think my favorite African designer at the moment is a guy in Mali called Sheikh Diallo. Sheikh is has a workshop in Bacamo, and he was trained in Paris, came back, and he teaches. In fact, he teaches some young people here as well. His design is just quite fresh. It is absolutely kind of uniquely African, but it is highly contemporary. And for me, he's the sort of, I think I usually refer to him as the rock star of African design. Doesn't speak a word of English, but we spend a lot of time together. He's an absolute sort of elder statesman for me, and is a gentleman. And his stuff goes for obscenely large amounts of money, and his design process is quite unique. He starts from the base. He can make stuff out of beer can tops, and he can put it on the market in Paris, and it can sell for $100,000. He really has a unique way of interpreting design. I think there's some really. I think there's a lot of unparalleled talent in Francophone Africa and also in Anglophone Africa. There's also a group in Swaziland called Gone Rural, run by a lady called Philippa Thorne. Philip has moved to Swaziland, literally moved in with the guys, has a team of weavers, and they weave metal, and they weave baskets, and they produce the most unique items. What catches my attention are the items that I can't put my finger on, and I can't track their origin. They just speak for themselves, but they're intriguing. So yeah, there's quite a lot of that all over the place. Hi. You're still alive. It's worth. You should celebrate that.
You're doing great until then. I just want to thank you for an incredibly sort of insightful and interesting presentation. I think it's everybody keeps talking about Africa as the next frontier, and Africa is where the future is, and all of that. But I don't think anyone actually really understands what that means. So to hear, from somebody who's actually in Africa and engaging with it, and literally on a day-to-day basis, sort of immersed in it, this is very, very interesting. And I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and I've lived in South Africa for a long time, travel all over Africa with work. So a lot of what you're saying is, what I've experienced and what I've seen, and there's so many misconceptions that you really sort of tackled and exposed. So that was very, very interesting. I just have one question: is how long have you been working in Africa?
Sure. I think where are we now? 2014. Probably about 14 years. And I think that was quite tentative at first. When I came here to South Africa originally, it was sort of just after the elections in '94, and we had been schooled by people like Kader Asmal and other people in exile who had chosen Ireland to live. So we were quite intrigued with it. And also, the whole Irish thing, kind of, we tried that process of a democracy in 1920 and 21, and it failed. It erupted in a civil war. So it was always a fascination as to what it was. So that's kind of what got me here initially. And then I started to sort of tentatively move around and tentatively travel, some, professional, and then it started to be quite professional. So I started doing for work. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been exclusively that. I think in 2012 and 2013, I did about 100 days a year in terms of being not here and being there, which is one in every 3 days, excluding weekends. So it's quite a lot. It's going to calm down a little bit because I think if I did 100 days this year, my wife would be kicking me out the house quite quickly. But it has been. What I do is I tend to want to do one thing when I travel. I tend to want to listen. So I read the same stuff. We all read the same stuff, but I sit there reading it in the mark, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. So what I'll typically do is I normally add an extra day onto every trip if I can, and I will go and lecture at a university, or I'll just go sit in the university canteen, or I'll go spend time with young people in different kind of contexts, and just sit and chat to them and ask them questions and really kind of try and deal with it at a qualitative level, because I think there's a lot of quantitative data that's out there, and most people will tell you we don't know if it's accurate. We don't know who generated it in the first place. So we're making some big decisions based on some very inaccurate information. So I much prefer to kind of immerse myself, and our team tend to immerse ourselves at the kind of coal face and spend time in that sort of chosen area. And sometimes it's the inverse. It's sharing stories with people who are from there. I was in Accra a few weeks ago with a young team, and this young girl had said, she's making these, she makes shoes, fashion shoes, and she says she's been trying to push it in her own market and in Lagos for some time it's not working, but the Canadians love her. I said, stop. Why are you trying to make your own people like your stuff? You don't have to. There's no necessity for it. These guys love you for some reason, and she's kind of flown to that part of the world and opened a store and done particularly well in the last couple of months. So I think it's really around finding your own space, and whatever your discipline is, or whatever your category is, and whatever you do, it's around maybe spending time in that space with those people, and your perception always changes. And then you have to keep it fresh because it changes all the time. What was particularly cool a couple of months ago is not particularly sort of fashionable or cool now. So what I have found is that while everything is quite kind of unique, there are some defining trends at the moment. And there are some things bringing people together. And it's amazing to see the kind of homogenization of youth culture. How young Africans, whether they're sitting in Lagos or Nairobi or Lusaka or Accra or Abuja, all starting to dress the same. For some reason, all starting to talk with the same funny accent. And all starting to listen to the same music. And that music is continentally shared. If you take a group like Mafiki Zolo at the moment, and you take Mafiki Zolo out the equation and you listen to their music, it's very difficult to discern where it came from. It's largely because their producer, Oskido, has done some real magical stuff, and he's bringing sounds together from Angola and from Central Africa and from West Africa and from East Africa, and he's putting it together. Kids in Lagos are listening to music from Nairobi and from South Africa. Kids in Abuja are listening to music from Cameroon. It's all blending together quite nicely. So while there are definitely sort of kind of a lot of micro trends that you have to kind of get into, there is a mega trend happening at the moment, and that's in the sort of in the youth culture space, and it's kind of starting to blossom quite nicely. Hi.
Talk about the influence of European colonialism, I guess, on design in Africa. How will China impact design across the country?
Ooh, that's a dangerous question. No, yeah. Thank you for setting me up in that fashion. I think from a design perspective, in terms of the sort of artisanal design, the kind of design we see in places like this, it's not going to have an impact on it. I think where it is having an impact on is in the area of spatial design, city planning and town planning, the kind of stuff that builds communities in the longer term. I think that's really, really important. There is a kind of a dangerous movement on the go across Africa at the moment, which is the sort of what we call pop-up communities. So communities that are popping up like big, bland kind of housing estates or big suburbs that are nothing other than apartments. Kind of feels like Midrand actually, and that's a problem because you're talking about people and peoples their economic ability is not the issue. They are social. We are social animals, and spending time with people on the continent, people are very, very social. You take that away from them, and you're going to have some really, really big problems. So spatial, and why it's a Chinese issue is they are doing a lot of the construction work, and they're putting up quite big townhouse complex housing estates, but not considering the impact of it, because there's no impact on them. They're building it and then sort of pulling on to the next project. But social design and spatial design and town planning is a real challenge at the moment, because people are not, and communities are not being formed. And that's quite risky. And it's not a working class issue. It's actually more of a middle class issue than a working class issue. It was an interesting case study in a funnily named town in Texas called Plano, which was essentially a middle class slum. Lots of houses, lots of similarity, but no social space. Nowhere for kids to play, no community centers, nowhere for people to go and connect. And the suicide, they couldn't understand why the suicide rate was so high. It was a real issue. I mean, even in places like South Africa, I mean, this area, areas like Midrand, areas like Fourways, there is and we talk, I mean, this is a really deep conversation around failure, and Ross only gave me 20 minutes, but if we got into a lot deeper, there's a real social meltdown at the moment, and the amount of young people going into psychiatric care because they are disconnected from society by being forced into these spaces that have no relation to each other. So it's not necessarily China as a country that's creating that issue, but that sort of Chinese build mentality, putting up buildings, moving on, not really considering the broader impact is a real issue. There were yes, young lady there. Hi. Sure. Okay, so let me deal with the second question first and the first question second. The second question is, it's a mixed bag of results. Those that have actually immersed themselves in the market and have kind of put teams of people in there are doing rather well. Those that are waiting for big briefs to come floating through the ether to land on their desk in Johannesburg for some poor client who's sitting in, I don't know, Kigali they're not doing so well. The fly-in, fly-out mentality is quite tough. I mean, I deal with it because I'm commuting around quite a bit, but I've got teams in a lot of these places. So it's like any market. It's really interesting is if you were to treat, let's say, London the same way you treat, let's say, Lagos, two similarly big cities, and you were to have one representative for your agency in London, and you were to fly in there once a month and just try and drum up business, it ain't going to go very well. You don't blame the British, you blame yourself. Somehow we reverse that psychology when we talk about various markets across Africa. We'll say, well, the place is not worked out, it wasn't my fault. It was your fault. You didn't spend time there. You didn't build your business. Some of the most successful creative and socially driven sort of agency entrepreneurs have come from here originally, but they've moved permanently into those places. So it's all a factor of immersion. I think the talent is here, and we have a very low cost base here, so there's a real benefit to doing work here and sometimes bringing it up, but that's not uniquely South African. You can get that out of India and other markets as well. How people are reacting to brands. Brands are big, and branding is big. It just depends on the brand. So there's this sort of this kind of growing culture of sort of craft brands and small brands, a real resurgent culture in places like Johannesburg. It's not really the same in those other markets. It's more of a big brand movement. Big brands are dominating. They're dominating in the financial services sector, in the sports arena, in a variety of other places. I think there's great opportunities for some of these markets are not particularly well segmented. So if you look at it strategically first, and you look at the market and saying, well, there's two brands in that space. Where's the uncontested space? And you develop a brand for that. They get sucked up quite quickly. I did something for developed a Nigerian insurance brand essentially a couple of years ago. It's flying because we just developed it in Nigeria for Nigerians and not with a kind of a broader mindset. So it's definitely a growth area. There were a couple more questions. Hi.
Just in terms of product designers, you talk about the design stars, making artisanal work and exporting it around the world. Do you see a trend at all for local designers designing for manufacturers, the local market, more mass market in Africa?
Great question. And the short answer is yes. So there is a real need to connect talented designers with the manufacturing process. And the challenge is the manufacturing process, not the design process. Manufacturing in continental manufacturing is not doing particularly well. It's in a recession and here, although there are some really good manufacturers here. You go to Mauritius, top-end manufacturing Mauritius, Morocco, Algeria, and interestingly Ethiopia is on a bounce back. I mean, it's said. I mean, Ethiopia is the second biggest economy in the continent, and population on the continent. It's 80 million people, moving to 100 quite quickly. We call it Planet Ethiopia because it really does exist quite differently to a lot of the other countries. It's a really amazing place. But the issue is the connectivity. There are categories of product that need what I would call an African design eye, without a doubt, and those are mass market products. To give you a good example of one which I've seen in India is a fridge that requires 1 hour of electricity a day to sustain itself for the remainder of that 24-hour period. Designed for households and it's about yay big, where they can pick the fridge up and carry it on their shoulder to their new dwelling because people move quite frequently, but also designed in such a way that it accepts the intermittence of power supply. Where you still see in cities across the continent these big fridges that are quite cumbersome to transport, relying on 24-hour power supply to work. So solving those kind of uniquely kind of continental, and they're becoming international problems now, but those problems in an African way from design process is really key. The manufacturing may not happen here. I think one wants to be a purist about it, but it's not necessarily possible. We're working with a group of designers at the moment. Say, stop trying to uplift your community. Stop. You can't. They can't manufacture what you want at the price point the market needs. Go to India, go to China, become mega successful, and then set up a smaller manufacturing facility in your hometown. But put product into the market and be successful, and then deal with the issues of upliftment after the fact. Stop trying to be all things to all people. There is a lot of talk about how to fix that, and I think really we are at the genesis of a big design movement continentally at the moment. This whole kind of African design thing's kind of a bit sort of, vague. It's hard to put your finger on it, but you can see it. You might not sort of know where it came from. You kind of know which part of the world it came from. That's kind of evolving and that's kind of growing quite nicely. I think tagging that into a manufacturing process from anywhere in the world is really, really important. That's how the Italians do really well. The Swiss, the Norwegians, they all have good design, good manufacturing, and then they get their product into the marketplace. So I think it's a very important question, not yet answered properly, but is definitely something that's tipping at the moment.